Okay, so I am going to present this week's review session in this pre-recorded video. There was some difficulty using the Zoom application this afternoon and recording the live session. So I'm going back over this for those of you who watch these videos after the fact at your leisure. I want to cover the week 15 material, which is a review of everything that we have covered over the semester since week 9, immediately following your midterm. So let me share my screen here with everybody. I've got my presentation slides queued up here. And what I'm going to do is just go back through the session as I did this afternoon and give you a sense of what I want to cover on a final exam. So I will present with you the concepts that we've covered since your midterm this afternoon. And then on Thursday, for those of you who opt to attend the Thursday session, if you would like, I'll go over the presentation that I made in preparation for your midterm exam. And that will, in effect, cover all of the concepts from the entire semester this week. Next week on Tuesday, I believe Tuesday is the last day of classes, ultimately for everyone. And so you're not required to come to any Zoom session next week. However, I will keep the appointment myself as an office hours commitment to you. And if there's anybody who wants to pop in with questions or any last minute concerns, I'll be available to you. Although you don't have to utilize that time, your only commitment for next week, make sure that you submit your paper by Sunday evening at midnight. And then don't forget to take your multiple choice final beginning Wednesday, and it'll be open from Wednesday at 12 a.m. Until Sunday at midnight. So that's April 28th to May 2nd. Okay. So that'll be your multiple choice final. It's really more like a super quiz, not really like a final exam. It's broad strokes. It's not designed to trip anybody up. It's just a basic accounting of all of the concepts that we covered throughout the semester. Not as much emphasis on the things in the beginning because you guys did have some other things going on around midterm time. But for you guys now, it'll just be a multiple choice deal, just to make sure that the things that we've gone over throughout the semester have sort of resonated with you in some way. And so I wouldn't worry terribly about it. I'm going to cover the broad strokes here. And on Thursday, I can go over the material from weeks 1 through 7. Okay. So this is weeks 9 through essentially 13 at this point. Okay, here we go. Don't forget your final paper, your final script is due on May 2nd at midnight at 11:59. Okay. You can turn it in at any time up to then. Okay. For full credit. I am leaving the assignment open beyond May 2nd. I'm leaving it open until midweek that week, although you will lose points if you turn it in late. And if it is, more than a couple of days late, you run the risk of not getting that final script graded at all and receiving a 0, because at the end of the semester, I have to have things wrapped up pretty quick for the department. So there's no time to waste. If you want full credit on that paper, you got to get it in by midnight on May 2nd. Okay. Or I'm sorry. I'm terribly sorry. On April 28th. Let's look at the calendar really quick. Let's make sure that Everything is completely clear. We're here on the 20th. Your final exam starts here and we'll close here. I'm sorry, your papers are due on the 25th. I'm sorry. And I have it open until the 28th, at which time you will lose 10 points per day. Okay. So yes, due April 25th. I'm sorry, due April 25th by 11:59. Okay. And most of you will be turning into me a new product, different from the script that you wrote in the beginning of the semester. Some of you have been given permission to carry on with a concept or a package that you were working on in the beginning of the semester. In other words, if you wrote me a pilot for the midterm script, you'll be writing me a subsequent episode or a final episode, or the remainder of a long pilot episode as your final project. New material, not refined existing material. I need to see new creative effort on your part that represents the last month or so of the course. Okay, after the midterm. So here it is. The rubric is pretty basic, and I look forward to reading your work. Okay, so let's take a look at the slides for today. So the remainder of the outline for this class, starting in week 9, we had the remainder of the world building conversation that we started in week, I think it was week 6 or 7 prior to the midterm exam. We talked about the first image. And then we had a very nice workshop involving discussions of first image samples from your scripts. Week 10 was the call to action and the inciting incident. Again, another productive workshop. And I really want to thank everybody for the success of these workshops that we've had in this semester. There's been a lot of quality contribution, some very generous sharing, and some great feedback as well. Not only in the live workshop sessions, but also in a lot of the discussion posts that we had for the semester as well. Okay, so that's been a really excellent experience, and I hope that you guys enjoy the concept of workshopping as much as I found it valuable in my own education when it came to evaluating my own writing. In week 11, we talk about rising action, complications on the road. This is all relevant to the hero's journey. Week 12 was halfway point. And then week 13 was falling action, climax, and denouement. Okay. So that was the outline for the remainder of the semester. And I want to point out that at this point, your bookshelf is pretty loaded with documents. These are all PDFs. You all have access to these documents beyond the semester. As long as you have access to this course in web courses, you can refer back to these PDFs for any information that you need. I highly recommend that you pick up at least a copy of the Screenwriter's Bible for your own professional library. It's good to have a hard copy. I have hard copies of all of these. I find all of these volumes extremely helpful in a number of ways. But in particular, the Screenwriter's Bible, it covers a lot of topics that are covered in these other volumes. But it really focuses on script writing format, and in some of the particulars of formatting that are not always automatically reconciled by, for instance, the final draft autocorrect function within that software. Things like montage and parentheticals and things that are covered in the Screenwriter's Bible. These are things that I've also seen as recurring problems in some of the submissions that I have looked at over the last semester in terms of overuse of direction in parentheticals in lines of dialogue. That's a particular picadillo on the part of a lot of readers in Hollywood. They don't want to see the spec writers or first draft authors giving performance direction to the characters through their dialogue lines. That's something that's usually worked out between the director and the performer. So that's something that we have to work on a little bit, only when it's absolutely necessary to the understanding or the performance of the scene should a parenthetical be included in a line of dialogue. And then there was other stuff like montage and things like that that can't solve themselves through any sort of autocorrect function within Final Draft, I'm sorry. So anyway, good books. Any one of these and all of these for that matter would be excellent additions to your professional library. And don't forget, you can write all this off of your taxes as well. So jumping into week 9, we had the first image concept that comes out of the world building portion of the semester. We had Michael Hogue's story structure in 6 stages as an example, talking about the setting, the world as it is prior to the inciting event, as it's described by folks like Lahu Shegri and Robert McKee, for instance. In the volume Story Structure Architect by Victoria Schmidt, she talks about story arc in the form of setup, and she talks about the setup giving us the direction of the story, giving us all the information that we need to get the story rolling, as well as defining the genre and the pacing of that story. Sid Field, in his book, talks about the first image and the realism, naturalness, or practicality, the setting as a product of adaptation from, say, a novel or some other form of IP. So taking that information, that resource material, and providing very strong visuals for the audience for our screenplays. Everything is related in a screenplay, so it becomes essential to introduce your story components from the beginning. And you've got about 10 pages to grab or hook your reader. So we're talking about the first 10 minutes of any screenplay being, the opportunity to draw your audience in, or do we send them to the kitchen for popcorn or to the restroom, right? Or to another channel, if we're talking about television. So knowing your story is extremely important. I used the example of The Devil Wears Prada as it encapsulates all of these concepts very well. The first 10 minutes and coincidentally the first 10 pages of the script are very informative. In that amount of time, we learn about Andy, we learn about her relationship, we learn about her personal world, her personal life, we learn about the world of Runway Magazine. We recognize her as the protagonist. We meet the antagonist in the form of Meryl Streep's character. We see the world of fashion. We're introduced to that, some of us presumably for the first time. We see how the culture clash between Andy's photojournalistic upbringing and Miranda's fashionista empire control are going to come into conflict. And she's going to grow. Our protagonist is going to grow from her experience. And we learn all of this. We have everything we know by the end of page 10 in the script. We're fully equipped to sit back and enjoy this story as it unfolds because of the expert writing and that particular screenplay. Robert McKee is talking about text and subtext in the context of the text, meaning the sensory surface of the work. In film, it happens to be the images that are on the screen, along with the soundtrack, the dialogue, the music, and the sound effects. What we see, what we hear, what people say, what people do. Subtext is the life under that surface, the thoughts and feelings, both known and unknown, hidden by our character's behavior. Setting and structure. We are warned about or to avoid cliche. Cliche, it said, is at the root of audience dissatisfaction. It's an abuse propagated by ignorance and present in all story media. The cause of this phenomenon is clear. All cliches can be traced back to one thing: the writer does not know the world of his story. Okay. This is a very big problem for a lot of young writers. We get really wrapped up in the action, sometimes in the dialogue that we want to present to an audience. And we get very narrow and laser focused on one idea, and we lose sight of the bigger picture. You know, what's the premise of the story? How is the protagonist supposed to evolve and change? What is the lesson that we're trying to impart? And how's this whole thing going to get wrapped up? What's the resolution going to look like? We need to have all of those things kind of firmly in place in our mind, so that as we follow through on the writing, it will have a smooth flow and a follow through that the audience can follow. And a lot of times, we can get lost in the spectacle of action, in the complexity of dialogue, in the exposition of dialogue, and as a result, get lost in the story and end up rambling on a tangent that will take us minutes or tens of minutes into valuable time on screen, where we need to be getting on with it and telling our story. I used Francis Ford Coppola as a really strong example, and I cited Apocalypse Now on a number of levels, from the concepts of storytelling, from rhetoric and storytelling, the use of current events and so forth, in terms of world building, and also in terms of story structure, giving a subtext or background for the themes in our screenplays. Apocalypse Now was particularly relevant in Coppola's career as a writer and then as a director. He famously said they had too much access to money and equipment, and little by little they went insane, meaning that they took a bunch of crew and a bunch of gear and were funded very, very amply to go into the jungle and sort out a story that really hadn't been fully realized prior to production. And through collaboration and through rewrites and through complications due to production difficulties like weather and so forth, he learned some really valuable lessons about really needing to understand what your story is, where you're going with it at all times, and who your characters are and how they're going to evolve. He used the backdrop of Vietnam. The real life public sphere was wrestling with issues of war, morality, empire building, and the Vietnam War was a powerful backdrop to reconform the story of ivory traders in Africa in Heart of Darkness, and reimagine that story with Vietnam as the backdrop, and having the protagonist be someone who is tasked with going out into the field and, in their words, terminating the command of a renegade field commander named Kurtz, played by Marlon Brando. And it mirrors a lot of real life stories of the time, and uses the backdrop of journalism, modern cultures, culture of the 60s and 70s in the United States, and the real events in the public and private sector, with the protests and so forth, and the electronic news gathering, and uses all of that rhetoric as a backdrop for reimagining the story of Heart of Darkness from Africa to Southeast Asia. That was a pretty effective example on a lot of levels of some really excellent filmmaking. So that was in context to setting and structure. And we want to remember that no matter how externalized through institutions or internalized by individuals, the political and economic, ideological, biological, and psychological forces of society can shape the events as much as period and landscape or costume. So I think it's really it's really convenient and can be very effective to use current events as a driver for your stories. And then because then you bring in the emotion of your audience, and issues they might have been considering, in real world context, and then you apply them to hypotheticals in your story, and sometimes we can come away with some very valuable insights. Check and make sure that your story does the following things. Does it focus on the inner as well as the unconscious outer conflicts that your characters are facing? Are you raising the level of personal conflict? Can you go higher or wider with your characters, particularly in things like battles or institutions in society? Can you look wider still on struggles against forces between man and the environment, for instance? From the subconscious to the stars, through all the multi-layered experiences of life, your story may be set at any one or combination of these levels. The inciting incident was a big topic of conversation for us in about week, well, we had it in a couple of different points in the semester, but week 13, I think we covered the inciting incident. For Apocalypse Now, it happened to be the commitment of troops to Vietnam after the Nixon police action during Nixon and LBJ administrations, the bombing of Cambodia and Vietnam and so forth. The hero, or the protagonist, if you will, in Apocalypse Now, we took a look at Captain Willard, and we talked about his evolution, the way his character has to evolve both naturally and painfully with the concepts of war and with his own personal ambition, and the notion that the point of view of the establishment was in conflict with one of their agents, Colonel Kurtz, who began to see war in different metaphorical terms. He then became an element that was deemed unacceptable or unconscionable in the context of war, and Captain Willard was asked to step in and relieve the man of command. And in the process, Willard goes through this adventure where he has to go in country into Vietnam, experience more of the war than he had the opportunity to do up to that point. And he reaches some very interesting conclusions and goes through some very life-changing experiences, and brings him to a new point of awareness of himself and of the world around him by the end of the film. And he becomes very unmade in a lot of ways as a result of his experience, in the same way that Kurtz does. And he ends up giving us this really excellent sort of final monologue about the horrors of war, the immorality that is both acceptable and unacceptable depending on what side of an argument you reside on, and some very compelling scenes and dialogue at the end of that film. So all of this that I'm talking about right now is first act preparation for your screenplay. So it's all of the things, with the exception of Kurtz's final monologue, this is all of the things that get our story into motion, right? So we have a world, we describe it, we show our protagonists and how they function within it. Then we present a situation to that protagonist that they have to face and endure or resolve in some way. They can reject it initially, but then they must accept it, and accept it in some way that sort of relegates them to an adventure where they're going to face challenges. They're going to meet and make friends or enemies. They're going to have conflicts. They're going to meet their mentors, seek advice from their mentors, evolve in some way, change in some way, and usually at some point then have a turnabout. And that'll happen in Act 2. So we're talking about Act 2 as a situation that presents the basic conflict of our story that has to be resolved, and our character has to address it within Act Two. So we're talking about when story begins and we adopt the hero's way, we're going to provide insight for our protagonist and derive meaning. We're going to guide them along the way with invigorating conflict and experience. The hero will be recharged or motivated or deepened in their understanding of their world through the experience of peril. They might lose their way. They might initially refuse the mission, refuse the call. They may experience misdirection or deception, or we as the authors may misdirect or deceive the audience, or the characters for that matter, in some way that doesn't reveal story before it's time, right? In other words, we can either give the audience an omnipotent point of view of the story, or we can force them through exposition to learn about facts about the story along with the protagonist, or we can keep the protagonist in the dark and we can merely tell the audience what's going on. So there's different ways to approach that problem. And we're talking about, we also talked about in week 13, I think it was, dramatic through lines. And so we're going to make decisions about the fate of our protagonists, in that we're going to ask some very important questions. And one of them is, do we want our character to succeed or to fail in their objective, right? So there's a series of through lines that we can choose that will help shape our story and our story structure. And it's basically five simple questions. Do you want your main character to succeed, or will they be defeated in some way? Do you want the main character to abandon their goal in lieu of a new goal? Do you want your main character's goal to be unclear or undefined in some way? Or do you want the reader to create the goal? In other words, is there some sort of interactive role between the audience and the characters? I think that's not necessarily a function of a film script necessarily, or a television script, but there are certainly in storylines written for video games an interactive component that can be considered here. But in terms of the character abandoning their goal, I gave you some very interesting examples when we talked about turning point. For instance, in Jurassic Park, the first half of the movie is all about visiting Hawaii and going on vacation and seeing this wonderful world, this wonderful natural history theme park, where they have recreated the DNA of dinosaurs from mosquitoes frozen in amber. And we see all these amazing creatures walking the earth, and it's a visual spectacle, and it has some family elements to it, and a lively component of learning and expression. And then we realize that, of course, where there are dinosaurs who are docile and vegetable eaters, there are predators and there is danger. And we see, even through the iconography of the Jurassic Park logo, the possibility of the existence of the Tyrannosaurus Rex. And of course, in the very middle of that script, at the turning point of that story, we meet the T-Rex for the first time. And all of the objectives of the characters shift from delight in experiencing incredible creatures and having fun seeing real live dinosaurs, to running for their lives from a natural predator that they should never have come in contact with in the first place, divided by millions of years of evolution. And so the movie starts off being a very light and lively thing, and ends up being an all-out race for survival. And I also cited King Kong for the same reason. In the beginning of the movie of King Kong, talking about the Peter Jackson version now, the first half of that movie is all about the characters wanting to set out into some very interesting natural environment and make a movie that's going to resurrect the careers of Jack Black and Naomi Watts and the different characters that are on the boat that are going out there looking for adventure. They find Skull Island and they explore a little bit, and in the process they discover a unique situation with a unique culture that has, that is yet undiscovered. And so the oil exploration component of their party decides to do a little investigating. Naomi Watts attracts the attention of the natives on the island, and they decide to kidnap her. And it's at this point that we learn that she's being offered to the gods, quote unquote. And when the rescue party goes to save Naomi Watts, we realize she's been strung up on an altar as an offering. And again, right at the turning point of that script, right in the middle of the story, in the exact middle of the text, we are introduced to King Kong for the first time. He snatches up Naomi Watts, says, "I'll take her. She's cute," and he runs into the jungle with the girl. And the second half of the movie shifts from exploration, adventure, and making a movie to rescuing the girl and possibly capturing the monkey, bringing Kong back, and selling tickets to audiences who want to come in and see the spectacle of this amazing giant creature. So all the goals of the team on the boat have shifted radically as well, and it all comes at the turning point. So these are all interesting ways to structure the stories, and to effectively, sort of guide the audience with some really interesting story structure that will lead them through sort of peaks and valleys of exposition. I cited for you the miniseries 000. This is something that I recently looked at on, I think it was Amazon Prime. It may be making the rounds right now on streaming TV services on the internet, but it was a really good example of an overarching story, which is about the cocaine trade between Central and South America and the consumer market in Europe and the United States, and how we follow the cocaine trade from production to transportation and delivery to sales on the street. And then we meet the characters involved, and we see that each of those key components has a story thread of its own, or an underlying theme of its own. The first one being betrayal. And so we have the grandfather, who's the head of the Italian cartel in the cocaine trade in Italy. He's the head of the family. He's the patriarch. He's going to be betrayed by his grandson, and we see the grandson as the emerging power within the structure of that family. Furthermore, we meet the people that are consigned with the transportation and delivery of the product from Mexico to Italy in Europe. And we find out that their patriarch dies. He's assassinated, and he has two children that are consigned with inheriting the family business, and one of them has to emerge as the new sort of head of the family. So we have the sister, who has the keen business mind and the practical decision-making powers of an executive. And then we have the eldest son, who is reluctant to take power, and who has a more serious internal wound, which is he has a fatal disease that is likely to take his life before he can become an effective leader of the shipping company that they use to transport the drugs across the Atlantic. We have an additional character here. He is the one of the tactical leaders of the Mexican elite police, and his typical job is to root out and bring to justice the perpetrators of the drug trade. But instead, he decides that nice guys finish last, and that it would be more fruitful for him financially if he were to, instead of, the old saying is, if you can't beat them, join them, right? And so he decides that he's fighting an uphill battle, being on the side of law and order, and he decides to become in effect a cartel boss, and he becomes a specialist in personal protection for the other cartel heads, the other family heads, and so forth. And so his ambition is his underlying thread. And so we're led very seductively through these storylines and through this overarching tale. And then it's the unlikeliest of outcomes, represented by the sister from the transportation company and the grandfather from the family in Italy, each of whom we're led to believe aren't cut out for the world of the drug trade, and by the end of the whole thing, they emerge as the winners, and their storylines run parallel to one another and mimic the theme of self-preservation or survival. So really interesting. It's only about 8 episodes, but it really is a good example of writers who are sticking to traditional story structure, and at the same time giving us these compelling underlying themes that we can sort of think about while we look at the bigger picture. And it provides a lot of different layers of interest and complexity to the story, which can again draw in a much broader audience than going for the very narrow sort of low-hanging fruit. Then I asked you a very pointed question somewhere around week 13 or so, and that was based on your experience from your foundations of story that you might have taken, or from some of the work that we have done here, and certainly from your copy of Poetics, which you're likely to have from film, was it film 1000 or film 1200? In Poetics, Aristotle talks about character being a subsidiary of action. And so do you believe that action takes precedence over character and character development? Or do you think, as LaHouche Egri does, that it's only through characters and their struggles and their evolution that we can have compelling action? It's that the action is born out of the character's struggle to reach their goal or to realize their ambition in some way. And that without these characters and their struggles, that there really can't be effective action. So the question is, which theory do you subscribe to? And that may indicate to you what sort of writer you are. For instance, I think that things like scripts written in the horror genre, for instance, are very self-serving in the way that they treat action as the spectacle, and then the characters become very sort of one-dimensional or underdeveloped as a result, because we don't spend a lot of time learning who they are, what their wounds are, what their ambitions are, and we don't focus on how they struggle to reach their goals, but rather we focus on the conflicts themselves and the logistics and details of conflict, and we get lost in those details, and story takes a back seat. You could make the same accusation of, for instance, superhero movies, and that they seem to be the characters seem to be sort of hollow and one-dimensional because it's really about watching robots and superheroes battle on the screen, more so than character arc and evolution. So I personally subscribe to the LaHouche Egri school of thought, which is without characters you have no story, and without characters there's really no action to speak of, because at the end of the day, what are we writing about? We're writing about people and telling stories about people. We are showing and demonstrating reflections of ourselves and our experience in the form of stories and characters that we write to entertain our audiences. So without those stories, without those characters and what they go through, what action would be compelling enough to sit in a theater for 2 hours? I don't know. Okay, talking about Michael Hogue and the 6 stages of story structure again, we talk about the point of no return. I gave you some video to watch from him, and like I was talking to you earlier about both the scripts from King Kong and Jurassic Park, they both reflect the existence of a very conspicuous turning point in the story, which is exactly, for the most part, halfway through the document. And at that point, we make critical discovery, and then objectives and motives shift from the first half of the film to the second half of the film. And the resolution and the climax and final resolution are all about a new objective for the protagonist. So there's Kong, there is Jurassic Park. I think I gave you some other examples too, but these were the ones that seemed to fit perfectly into that analysis. And I think if you take your own favorite story and get a copy of the script, count up the number of scenes or the number of pages, divide that number in half, and then go to that spot in the script and see if you can get a sense of a turning point wherever that led you. Okay. In Jurassic Park, for instance, we have a script that is what is it? It's a 200. It's a 100 and I think it's 153 page script, something like that. It results in a 2-hour movie, pretty much exactly. And at minute 63, bam, we meet the T-Rex. And I think, did I give you the page count here somewhere? I did. Scene 50, page 78 out of 153 pages, I think it was. So bam, that's pretty much right in the middle. Scene 50 out of 100 scenes, 2-hour movie. We meet the T-Rex, comes crashing out of the jungle to eat the little goat that's chained up on beside the fence, right? And then he wreaks havoc with all of the park vehicles and stuff, and sends the kids and the parents and everybody scattered, running for their lives. And the rest of the movie is all about them finding each other and surviving the assault of the T-Rex. And in Kong, I think this is happening, page 73 of a 136 page script. Okay, so you figure 140 pages in round numbers, page 70 ought to be the turning point. Bam, page 73, Kong comes crashing out of the jungle just like the T-Rex, sees Naomi Watts hanging from the pillars, walks over, snatches her from her bindings, and walks off with her into the woods. Right exactly halfway through the film. So see if your favorite film conforms to this analysis as well. It'd be interesting to find out how many folks are finding this to be particularly true. And how many are not seeing an effective example. I got friends who, state emphatically that this is exactly true, and that all good scripts will at some point demonstrate their superiority over the average storytelling by these little telltale signs. Go to midway through a good script, and you'll always find the turning point. So it's an interesting thought to add to your understanding of story structure. So we're talking about the Freytag, the simplified story structure diagram by Freytag, where we see exposition, inciting incident, the rising action, climax, resolution, and denouement. And it's interesting to see everything sort of simplified in this structure, because here is the reason for the whole adventure to start. Here is the ultimate outcome. Here was the turning point where everything went from all is lost to we can actually do this thing. And then after the resolution, we have the denouement, which is the sort of summing up of, or the processing of the whole adventure. And it is different from the resolution in that the resolution might simply be the solution to the primary conflict of the film, whereas the denouement is then the aftermath. It's the world as it has changed in contrast to the world as it was before the inciting incident. So this is a really interesting basic story structure diagram that you can sort of keep handy and avail yourself to from time to time, and just check and make sure that your structure is sort of falling in line with this basic sort of 3-act concept with midpoint. Finally, I introduced 3 topics for you at the end of this semester. 3 things to avoid, some pitfalls, and they were Chekhov's gun, the existence of a phenomenon called the MacGuffin, and then the phenomenon of the Deus Ex Machina concept. Of the three, the Chekhov's gun is one of the things that you want to try and employ in your story structure, and that is the idea that if you any elements that you include in your story that are presented to the audience, and in Chekhov's case, it was a gun in one of his screenplays, right, or one of his theater plays. Chekhov said, if you're going to show your audience a gun in Act 1, you better use it by Act 3. So the concept is any elements that you include in your story should serve the purpose of, resolving the premise, or, wrapping up the concept, resolving the story itself. And that if you show it and you don't use it, that you've somehow created superfluous content that you could edit out of your story, to either cut down on time or cut down on, what you're asking the audience to understand and digest in the course of, say, 2 hours. The theory posits specifically that every element within a piece of writing should contribute directly to the overall concept. Anything else is superfluous and you should get rid of it. The opposite is what we want to avoid. The opposite is the idea that there can be a MacGuffin. There can be an element of your story that all the characters seem to be concerned with, but the audience could care less. And we'll talk about that in a moment. A good example of, the at least understanding, if not application, of Chekhov's gun, I think, was in The Wrath of Khan, one of the Star Trek movies. And it was the Kobayashi Maru. It was the test that Starfleet gives to all of their officer candidates. And it is it's an exercise designed to evaluate the leadership and decision-making qualities of their officer candidates. It's a no-win situation. It's not designed for winners and losers. It's designed to sort of identify key aspects of somebody's decision-making process, their moral base, or their leadership quality. And so in the beginning of the movie, the Enterprise is getting a new I think she was a science officer, Lieutenant Savick, and Kirk meets her and greets her on her first trip to the Enterprise, and they have a little discussion, and he compliments her on her performance on the Kobayashi Maru, and she cites that she was sort of merely following him as a role model, and that his own personal performance on the Kobayashi Maru when he was a candidate in officer school was very unique and had never been duplicated by anybody before or since. And we find out at a later point in the movie, we learn how and why Kirk took the Kobayashi Maru, that he took it apparently more than once, and that ultimately to succeed, he cheated, which revealed some very interesting qualities about his character that we may or may not have realized up to that point. And it sort of timed itself very perfectly with a moment in the story, or a turning point in the story, where Kirk goes from the defensive to the offensive, and expedites a plan that he's been sort of hatching all along, that indicates that he is again cheating but in a real life scenario where he has to overcome a very cunning adversary, and he does it through misdirection and through lying and misleading, and through sort of misdirection of assets and activity. Fools Khan into thinking one thing, and then he springs his trap, and they move forward in the story. And we have this interesting new dimension about Kirk that we never thought about before. In terms of the MacGuffin, it was very eloquently phrased by by Alfred Hitchcock when he described the MacGuffin as storytelling nonsense, or the stupid element of a story. In other words, the last bold act of a lazy writer. Or not necessarily, that's actually more of an accurate analysis of the Deus Ex Machina, but the MacGuffin rather is a stupid element of story that is presented in a way that seems to be important. The characters are all struggling to know it, obtain it, consume it, whatever. But the audience really could care less, and ultimately it doesn't seem to have any real effect on the outcome of the story. And I chose as an example the Heart of the Ocean diamond that is portrayed in the film Titanic. And the idea that Titanic is a movie that consists of two entwined storylines. One of them is a love story that is hypothetical. The other is a truer version of events surrounding the actual HMS Titanic and the sinking of that luxury cruise liner in 1919, I think it was. And in the middle of these two intertwined stories that mesh very nicely together, by the way, we have this sort of wonky story about Bill Paxton's character, who is a salvage diver, and he has learned about, through research and documentation, the existence of this diamond that supposedly was locked in a safe and went down with the ship. It turns out the safe belonged to a man that Rose McGowan was, or not Rose McGowan, the character Rose in the movie, she was betrothed to, and the character was Billy Zane, and he was a Wall Street new money sort of aristocrat who was on vacation in Europe at the time, hitching a ride back on the Titanic with his bride-to-be. And he presents her with the heart of the ocean as an engagement present, I guess you would call it. And it's alleged that it's used as a mechanism in a couple of instances in the story to get Leonardo to clash and conflict with Billy Zane, so that it can facilitate a decision that Rose has to make, whether she should, as a debutante, stay betrothed to the rich guy who she doesn't really care for, or run away with the poor guy who she has fallen in love with in the character of Leonardo DiCaprio. And so it's really used as a lever in that respect, and doesn't really serve much more of a story purpose until the very end, when we realize that Rose had the heart of the ocean all the time. It never went down with the ship, which negates the value of Paxton's character, because she never gives it to him. She throws it in the water at the end of the movie anyway, and then she dies. And it really is something that doesn't seem to play into either the sinking of the ship or the effective, story of love between Leonardo and Rose. So in that respect, I think it's a good example of a MacGuffin. Other folks have cited Luke's lightsaber in the recent Star Wars movies as a MacGuffin. Rey is seeking the lightsaber for some mystical reason. She thinks it's going to empower her in some way. She finds the lightsaber and finds her way to Luke Skywalker. And when she presents it to Luke as a demonstration of her readiness and achievement to receive the Force, he says, "Oh, that's nice," and he throws it into the ocean. And therefore, the lightsaber really didn't have much of a functional role in the overall story. And then we're left as an audience sitting thinking, well, why did we have to endure the last 45 minutes of this movie watching her go find the lightsaber if it didn't really mean anything? What was the point of that? When we could have learned other things, or we could have seen other aspects of this story that might have been more entertaining or more relevant. The existence of a MacGuffin sometimes is a forgivable use on the part of the writer, and other times, it can be make or break for the audience, and it might be the very thing that convinces some people that a movie wasn't very good or that it was very good. Is whether or not the author resorts to sort of cheap tricks like misdirection in the form of a MacGuffin, rather than just sticking to the story, the basic story that was good enough to write a script on in the first place. The other pitfall I was talking about that I alluded to, the Deus Ex Machina. It's a phrase that comes from Old Latin, and it describes a solution out of the old Greek stage play craft, which if you translate the words directly from the Latin to the English, it means a god from a machine. Okay. But what it's really describing is a mechanism that they actually used to use in Greek theater, where they would take a big sort of crane arm and lower, swing over the stage or the theater, the thrust or the proscenium, and lower a character into the center of the dialogue or the action representing the gods. And the notion was that, man is fallible and dependent on the gods for their ultimate survival and nurture, and that man's struggles are very honorable and very complex, but they usually get in over their heads and have to be rescued or saved in some way by the gods. And this was kind of an underlying theme in a lot of the early Greek plays. And this term Deus Ex Machina has become synonymous with the notion that when a writer writes themselves into a corner and there doesn't seem to be any likely resolution on the part of the protagonist or any of the protagonist's posse, that the writer's going to swoop down with some sort of supernatural solution to the problem, which is going to bail them all out and bring resolution to the story, rather than, let things play out into their what would be their natural or likely outcomes. And so that is said to be the mark of a lazy writer, when you have to sort of come up with something at the last minute. Oh, by the way, this thing is going to save the day now, when we think all is lost. And the most common example of the ex machina theory put forth is the eagles at the end of The Lord of the Rings. And so we have this epic tale of Frodo and Sam going through Mordor with the ring, and the challenges and the difficulties and the tests of faith and tests of strength and resilience, and they finally succeed in throwing the ring into the fires of Mordor. And on the way out, they become trapped by the lava and the fact that the mountain is sort of imploding and destroying itself when the ring has been eradicated. And lo and behold, out of nowhere come the eagles to save Frodo and Sam from what is clearly going to be their impending death, raising the question, why the hell didn't the eagles just take them there in the first place, instead of having them go through all of those incredible circumstances, risking life and limb, when they could have hitched a ride with the eagles in the first place? So that's a really good example of the Deus Ex Machina at work. The gods have somehow seen fit to send the eagles to extract you from Mordor, instead of you meeting your impending doom as you likely should. Other folks have leveled criticism at Harry Potter for the same reason. Something about a traveler's token or spell that was given to Hermione, and something like an episode and a half of those installments. She has this thing, and we kind of forget about it until I think it's the Prisoner of Azkaban, maybe, where she pulls it out at the last minute and says, oh yeah, I've got this thing that's going to bail us out of this impending problem that would likely kill us if I didn't have this talisman, right? And so that has fallen under scrutiny with a lot of hardcore fans of Harry Potter for that reason. There's been other situations that have sort of been cited that follow this same kind of theme. The point here is, you know, see your story through to its logical and likely conclusions, and don't be lazy in your writing. And if your characters need to be saved by some supernatural imposition at the very end of your script, then you probably haven't laid your groundwork effectively enough in acts 1 and 2. So think about that when you are putting your stories together. Structure can be a very helpful discipline to adhere to, because it informs your actions in terms of a writer. You'll never have to guess what's going to happen if you know what the obligations of your structure demand. And the hero's journey, for that matter, the hero's journey is time and time again proven to be a fairly solid and reliable structure with which to construct and evolve heroes as well as antagonists. And that the stages of the hero's journey that are implied by Christopher Vogler, by Joseph Campbell, by a number of different writers. I think Egri talks a little bit about the hero's journey. It's addressed a little bit in the Screenwriter's Bible, and certainly in 45 Master Characters, which I've given you on your bookshelf. It talks about different characters and what their arcs might be. It's a proven theory that fits very well into a lot of stories and a lot of scripts. And the idea is that we've seen this repetition time and time again generationally, to the point where human beings, going back to our earliest storytelling beginnings, have been following this kind of story structure and archetypal character development and iconic character behavior over and over and over again. And that's that the best films and the best stories tend to follow very closely the tenets of story structure and hero's journey, and they work very well using applications like Chekhov's theory on the gun, and at the same time avoid lazy sort of cliches like supernatural solutions and misdirected story elements that really lead nowhere. So the whole point is to help you avoid what some writers fear the most and consider an inevitable problem that they will face at some point in their career, which is writer's block. I don't subscribe to writer's block. I think that there are too many, for lack of a better word, templates that we can use that will help us to fulfill our stories, flesh out our characters, decide on their actions, decide on their behaviors. And actions and behaviors on the parts of characters lead directly to action and events, right? So it's a LaHouche Egri sided argument when we talk about characters versus actions, which one takes precedence in a story. If the characters are designed well, if we know their subtext and we know their backstory and we know their traits, and we know and we have a good idea of how they're likely to articulate their feelings or their behaviors through dialogue, half of our work is done for us. And then the rest of it is simply knowing how we want that story to evolve, knowing what the basic message is, and then applying a structure to it that we can then sort of plug in all of our elements very neatly. And it can all come together very cleanly and very precisely. And it's just a process. And if you follow it, I think it will help you reap many, many rewards. So that would, in essence, sum up the semester for us. This is the end of my presentation for this afternoon. Like I said, if you want, I can go over my midterm presentation to sort of refresh your memory about concepts we covered in the beginning of the course. As I was saying to my afternoon class, I think I favor the latter half of this semester versus the beginning. In the beginning, it's a lot of clerical work, right? We learn how to use documents like beat sheets and character dossiers, and we learn how to write treatments and prepare presentation packages like your pitches. And it's all kind of very mechanical and very it's like bookkeeping, right? And it's very, not a whole lot about the discipline of writing that we're talking about now. But we have to get through that, right? We have to provide a foundation so that we can build on that foundation with, more information, more skill building, more discovery and practice of the discipline of writing. So I think in essence, it's been a good time. I've enjoyed teaching this class, and I appreciate everybody's participation and feedback that I've gotten. So I'll just put it out there that this week, even though I'll talk to you again on Thursday about more of these concepts, I am open to meetups either through Zoom or through telephone or even maybe email if your questions are quick and easy. But anybody who has any outstanding concerns or issues that they want to resolve before the end of the semester, maybe questions about your final project, whatever it is, reach out to me either through the email. I think the email is the best if you have a quick question or if you want to request a meeting. And then I'll get back to you. We'll talk about the times that work best for you, and we'll sort you out. Okay. We have pretty much this week to do that. Next week, by Wednesday, you're going to be able to access your final quiz, and you have your paper due on Sunday. So if you need some time with me, I'm happy to meet with you and help you sort out whatever you've got going on. Okay. So that's it. So don't forget about your deadlines, and I'll see you here on Thursday. And then don't worry about, there's no mandatory Zoom meeting for next week on Tuesday. That's pretty much the end of classes for everybody. Although I will keep the appointment, I will be present for the Zoom session in case anybody wants to show up with questions or anything. I mean, we can even workshop something if you want to. I'll be available for that, but it's not required. Okay. At that point, all you're responsible for next week is taking the quiz and then having a nice summer. So thanks so much for your time and attention. I appreciate it. I'll see you again on Thursday. And in the meantime, if you want a meeting, just shoot me an email and we'll sort you out. Okay. Thanks so much. Have a good afternoon. And I'll talk to you again real soon. Thanks.